Hello everyone. Today in this module we are going to talk about mechanisms of succession. Ecological succession is a process in which there is a change of structure of species in an ecological community over time. So in this module we are going to talk about how this mechanism takes place, what are the theories which are supporting the mechanism of succession in course of time. The learning objectives of this module are the holistic concept, then the reductionist concept, the mechanistic models and general trends during succession. So we will be doing these topics in this module. Mechanisms of succession. Mechanism of succession was described earlier by Henry Thoreau in 1860, Anton Kerner in 1863 and Cowles in 1899, yet it was Clemens in 1916 who first proposed a descriptive theory of succession and developed it as an ecological concept. In general, the two major concepts or views which explain the mechanism of succession in different situations are holistic concept and reductionist concept. Although these models differ significantly in their predictions about the organizing principles of successional dynamics, it appears that none of them are correct all of the time. The holistic concept or the view. Holistic concept was first proposed by F. E. Clemens in 1916. Clemens described climax vegetation as a superorganism which arises, grows, matures and dies. It was analogous to the embryological development of an organism where several stages are represented by various embryonic stages of this superorganism, that is, each stage of succession represented a step in the development of a superorganism, the climax. This concept is also known as organismal theory. The climax was an assemblage of vegetation that belonged to the highest type of vegetational community possible under the prevailing climate. The climax, according to Clemens, is able to reproduce itself, repeating with essential fidelity the stages of its development. Each serial stage so modifies the environment that plants of that stage eventually can no longer exist there. Instead, they prepare the site for the replacement plants of the next stage. The process continues until the vegetation arrives at the self-reproducing climax that marks at the end of the succession. Each community occurs at a time and each community gives way to the other community, that is, communities are discrete in time and succession is composed of several discrete serial communities. Course of succession thus can be predicted. As per this hypothesis, succession is driven by changes in attributes between pioneer and major systems. Succession involves changes in the emergent properties that arise out of the organization of the ecosystem. Succession eventually leads to the formation of an emergent entity with unique characters involving nutrient flow, biomass accumulation and species diversity. Succession begins with the developmental stages of short-lived, shade-intolerant plant species and terminates with a mature stage dominated by long-lived, shade-tolerant species. Young stages so modify the environment that the existing community is replaced by a more mature one, better able to exploit the changed environment. There are two major theories based on this concept, and they are: the first one is the relay floristic theory, the second one is the facilitation model theory. The relay floristic model or the theory. This theory was proposed by Frank Eckler in 1954. As per this theory, groups of associated species marching together and disappearing through time as one group replaces another, that is, each community relays the site to the next community. The driving force behind succession is the reaction of the site to the plants living on it. Each serial stage so modifies the environment that plants of that stage eventually can no longer exist there. Instead, they prepare the site for the replacement of the plants of the next stage, and the process continues until vegetation arrives at the self-reproducing climax, that is, the end of succession. Basic fundamentals of the theory are that of the total species which arrive in a bare area, only a few are able to grow and mature. The early successional species modify the habitat in such a manner that it becomes more suitable for the late successional species and less suitable for the early successional species. This slide shows the diagrammatic representation of the relay floristic model of succession described in old field succession. The importance of the species at a given time is represented in terms of thickness of the line. Let's talk about the facilitation model theory. This theory was proposed by Cornell and Slattery in 1977. The facilitation model, basically a Clementian approach, is autogenic. Changes are brought about from within by the organism themselves. Early stage species modify the environment and prepare the site for the later stage species, facilitating their success. That is, the first serial stage facilitates the development of the next serial community. Facilitation model seems to be most appropriate in explaining changes in many primary successions, but less so for secondary successions. Reductionist concept or population approach. Henry Gleason in 1917 did not support the views of Clements on succession, as he believed that the climax is not a superorganism. He thus supported a new concept of succession and is called reductionist concept. As per this concept, succession is a result of the independent responses to environmental conditions of an individual species that constitute the community, that is, the individual responses of different species to environment. That is the reason this concept is often known as population concept or approach. The course of succession is determined by the propagules of plants that arrived first on the site and were able to establish themselves under prevailing environmental conditions. Various types of interactions, including competition among different species and the environment, determine the course of succession. The resultant microenvironment, the potentiality of the plants to utilize various resources, example nutrients, moisture, light, space, etc., and other environmental inputs on the site regulate the occurrence of the final mature vegetation, that is equivalent to the climax. Course of succession thus cannot be predicted. There are three major theories based on these concepts, and they are initial floristic composition model theory, tolerance model theory, and inhibition model theory. The initial floristic composition and model was proposed by Eckler in 1954 and is parallel to the relay floristic model, whereas tolerance model and inhibition model are described by Joe Cornell and Slattery in 1977 and were parallel to facilitation model. Initial floristic composition model. As per this module, course of succession in many situations are governed by chance and differential longevity of the plants, and thus in some way it is not predictable. Propagules of most species, that is all the pioneer species, many of the serial species and some of the climax species are present initially on site. Life history characteristics and competitive interactions will decide which species become dominant. Propagules of early successional community, that is the pioneer species, are generally quick growing and smaller or short in height, whereas other serial species are larger, longer lived and growing slowly. that is growing over a period of time and attain maturity later. Latter species which grow slow eventually dominates the site and outcompete the quick growing former species. It is the chance and longevity of species that determine which species will dominate the community. Since the arrival of propagules is just a matter of chance, the course of succession in any way is not predictable. Therefore, the site does not relate from one community to another, but there is a sorting out of species at a time based mainly on its longevity. The next slide shows the diagrammatic representation of the initial floristic composition model of succession described in old field succession. The importance of the species at a given time is represented in terms of thickness of the line. Tolerance model. Of the species that arrive in the bare area, any one of them can establish and survive as adult. No initial selection pressure exists. The environment or habitat will be modified in such a manner that it becomes less suitable for the early species, but will exert little or no effect on subsequent species. Juvenile of late successional which invade the site can grow to maturity in continued presence of individual of early successionals. Later successional species are neither inhibited nor aided by species of earlier stages, that is, they can grow to maturity in the presence of earlier stage species. Since the latter species have a greater tolerance for the lower level of resources than the earlier ones, such interactions lead to community composed of those species which are most efficient in exploiting resources either by interference, competition, or by using resources unavailable to other species. In contrast with predictions of the Facilitation model, the early occupants of this site do not change environment condition in ways that favor the subsequent invasion of later successional species. Rather, with increased time, the various species sort themselves out through their differing tolerances of the successionally increasing intensity of biological stresses associated with competition. In the tolerance model, competition intolerant species are relatively successful early in succession when site conditions are characterized by a free availability of resources. However, these species are eliminated later on because they are not as competitive as later species, which eventually develop a climax community. Some of the course of secondary association can be described by a tolerance model. Next to study is the inhibition model. Of the species that arrive in bare area, any of them can establish and grow to maturity. No species is competitively superior to another, but the site belongs to those species that become established first and are able to hold their positions against all invaders. They make the site less suitable for both early and late successional species. As long as they continue to germinate, they suppress or exclude the subsequent colonies of late arrivals, that is, as long as they live, they maintain their position. The ultimate winner is generally long-lived plants, even though the early successional species may suppress later species for a long time. Such succession is not orderly and is less predictable. This model is purely competitive in nature. Inhibition model can describe the course of succession of a number of secondary and primary successions. The relatively vigorous development of ecological communities during secondary succession means that competition rapidly becomes an organizing force in the community. So, there is an intensification of interactions by which organisms interfere with and inhibit each other. The concepts and their models described earlier are mainly based on the shifting pattern of species dominance as a product of responses of interaction of plants and the environment, both at temporal and spatial level. A new approach based on experimental and computational studies has now been conducted to explain the temporal and spatial dynamics of communities and ecosystems, and such approaches are maintained as mechanistic model. Talking about the mechanistic model, these are relatively new approach where both the direct observations and the computer simulations are used to explain the temporal and spatial dynamics of communities and ecosystems. This approach is based on both the direct process by which an interaction, that is competition, occurs, and also the influence of various traits of individuals, mainly physiology, morphology and life history on course of succession. There are two major models or hypotheses under this approach, which goes like resource ratio model and individual based plant model. Resource ratio model. This model was proposed by Tillman in 1985 and 1988. As per this model, there are two major components which are considered as drivers of succession. Number one is the interspecific competition for resources, and second is the interspecific competition for limiting resources, that is soil, nutrients and light. The course of succession is regulated by the changes in relative availability of resources through time and result in resource gradient. Community composition changes along the gradient as the availability of resource changes. Resource gradient ranges from habitats with low soil nutrients but with high availability of light at the soil surface, generally represented by early successional sites, to habitats with nutrient rich but low availability of light, represented by late successional sites. Talking about the individual based plant model, this model was explained by Hudson and Smith in 1987 and somewhat based on reductionist approach. As per this module, succession is a population process involving competition. The model is based on competition among individual plants to explain species replacement on a temporal and spatial gradient. Hudson and Smith gave their species the following 5 specific traits. Number 1 is the maximum size, then is the maximum age, growth rate, tolerance for shade, rate of seed production. They consider light as the limiting source. It assumes that both relevant environmental resources and the intensity of competition changes through time and among communities. This model is based on the following 3 presumptions. The first one is, as plant grows, they alter the environment in such a way that the relative availability of resource changes, altering the rules of competitional success. Second, the physiological trait of plants prevent any one species from achieving maximum competition availability under all circumstances. And third is the interaction between 1 and 2 produces an inverse correlation between certain groups of traits. So, species that are good competitors under one set of environmental conditions are poor competitors under another. Hudson and Smith, by applying computer simulation, could illustrate the various patterns of vegetational change that result from different combination of traits. This slide shows us the general trends during succession. During the course of succession, there are considerable changes that occur in vegetation and ecosystem traits. Odum in 1969 was the first to document these changes and present a table of 24 ecosystem traits that, according to him, changes significantly during the course of succession. Barber, Burke and Pitts in 1987 identified 14 important vegetation and ecosystem traits that generally change during course of progressive succession. They consider the status of each trait as early and late stage of succession and not the pioneer and climax stage, and are represented below in the form of a table. These are the 14 traits, and the early stages and the late stages are given in the table. To summarize this module, we can say that different schools of people have described the mechanism of succession in different theories and models. Ecology is an important stream, and I think that further research is needed to understand the mechanism of succession, taking these theories and models as base. Thank you.